Help him!
Oh, God.
We need a doctor here now.
The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and panic. A heart monitor screamed in sharp, broken beeps as an old man lay motionless on a stretcher, his chest barely rising. Nurses rushed past, voices overlapping, hands shaking. A few steps away, a pregnant young woman clutched her swollen belly and sank to the cold floor, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Please, not now." Then suddenly, the glass doors burst open. A tall, powerful man in an expensive suit ran inside, his confident mask shattered. When he saw the dying man, he froze, then dropped to his knees. "Father!" he cried, his voice breaking. And in that moment, no one knew how a starving stranger and a poor, pregnant girl were about to change everything. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Beata Habimana woke up before the sun as she always did. The thin light creeping through the cracked window of her one-room shack was her alarm clock. There was no electricity to wake her, no phone vibrating on a bedside table. Just the distant sound of motorbikes starting up and the familiar ache in her lower back reminding her that her body was carrying more weight than it could comfortably bear. She sat up slowly, one hand pressing against her swollen belly. "Easy, easy, my little one," she whispered, breathing through the discomfort. At 22 years old, Beata had learned patience the hard way. Her room was barely big enough to stretch her legs. A thin foam mattress lay on the floor, pushed against a wall, stained with years of dampness. In the corner stood a small wooden crate that served as both table and chair. Hanging from a nail was the only good dress she owned, saved for days when she needed to look presentable to customers who pretended not to notice her shaking hands. Outside, the city was already awake. Kigali's streets never truly slept, but mornings were the most honest part of the day when the poor hurried to claim their corners before opportunity slipped past them. Beata reached into a small cloth pouch tied beside her mattress. Her fingers counted the bills carefully, as if touching them too roughly might make them disappear. $7. That was all she had left. $7 to buy fruit, $7 to eat, $7 to survive until the baby came. She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the familiar wave of fear. She had learned not to cry easily. Tears wasted energy, and energy was something she couldn't afford to lose. The father of her child had once promised her a future. He had been kind at first, smiling, full of plans. But the day she told him she was pregnant, his face changed. His voice hardened. Within a week he was gone, his phone silent, his room empty. His promises evaporated like morning mist. Beata never chased him. Begging someone to stay felt worse than being alone. She stood up, washed her face with water from a plastic bucket, and tied her scarf neatly around her head. Then she picked up her basket, half empty, waiting to be filled, and stepped outside. Her spot was near a busy intersection where office workers passed by on their way to glass buildings that reflected the sky but never reflected people like her. She rented the space unofficially, paying a small fee to anyone who threatened to move her along. By mid-morning, the sun was already hot. Beata arranged bananas, oranges, and a few avocados on a cloth laid over the pavement. She smiled when people looked at her, even when they didn't smile back. Fresh fruit, she called softly. Very sweet. Some ignored her. Some stared at her belly with judgment. A few bought something, dropping coins into her hand without meeting her eyes. Around noon, her friend Nalia Uemana appeared, balancing a tray of roasted maize on her head. "You're early today," Nalia said, lowering the tray and wiping sweat from her forehead. Beata shrugged. "I couldn't sleep." Nalia glanced at Beata's belly, then at the small pile of money beside her basket. "How much do you have left?" Beata hesitated, then answered honestly. $7. Nalia's face tightened. "That's dangerous." "I know. You should save it, buy food, or keep it for the hospital." Beata nodded, though she knew $7 wouldn't even cover half a day at the hospital if something went wrong. They worked in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. Hunger gnawed at Beata's stomach, but she ignored it. She had learned to recognize hunger as just another sound the body made, like traffic or wind. Then she saw him. At first, Beata thought he was drunk. The old man stood a few steps away, swaying slightly, his clothes hanging loosely from a frame that had once been strong. His beard was gray and untrimmed, his eyes sunken but alert. He watched the fruit with a quiet intensity that made her chest tighten. He took a hesitant step forward. "Please," he said, his voice dry. "Just a little food." Before Beata could respond, a man passing by snapped, "Go away," and waved him off as if shooing a fly. The old man flinched but didn't leave. Nalia leaned closer to Beata. "Don't," she whispered urgently. "Look at him. You don't know where he's been. And you, Beata, you're pregnant." Beata looked at her basket, at the bananas, at the oranges. Then she looked at the old man's hands. They were shaking. "Please," he said again, softer now. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." Something twisted inside Beata's chest. She knew hunger. She knew that particular kind of weakness that made the world tilt and sounds blur at the edges. She also knew fear, fear of tomorrow, fear of childbirth, fear of what would happen if her last $7 disappeared. Her hand moved unconsciously to her belly. "What if this money is all we have?" a voice inside her warned. Another voice answered just as quietly. "What if this man doesn't live to see tomorrow?" She swallowed hard. "How much do you have?" Nalia asked, almost pleading. "Think about your baby." Beata took a slow breath. "I am thinking about my baby," she said. She reached for the money. The old man's eyes widened slightly as she selected bananas, an orange, and a small bottle of water from a nearby stall. She paid without counting the change. $7 gone. She handed the food to him. "Sit," she said gently, pointing to the curb. "Eat slowly." The old man stared at her as if she had placed gold in his hands. "May God bless you," he whispered, tears filling his eyes. "You have saved me." Beata smiled, though her chest felt tight. "Just eat." As he ate, she noticed how carefully he chewed, as if afraid the food might vanish. When he finished, he wiped his mouth and looked at her belly. "When is the child coming?" he asked. "Soon," she replied. "Very soon." He nodded slowly. "Then may your child never know hunger." Those words stayed with her long after he shuffled away. That evening, Beata packed up early. There was nothing left to sell and no money left to buy dinner. Her steps felt heavier as she walked back to her room. Inside, the space felt colder than usual. She sat on the mattress, holding her belly, listening to it growl in protest. "It's okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was comforting. "We will survive." But as night fell and hunger pressed harder, fear crept in. She had given everything she had to a stranger, and tomorrow she had nothing. The night passed slowly for Beata Habimana. Hunger has a way of stretching time, turning minutes into hours. Each time she shifted on the thin mattress, her stomach tightened in protest, and the baby responded with a gentle but insistent movement, as if asking a question she had no answer to. When morning came, Beata did not feel rested. She felt hollow. She washed her face, tied her scarf, and stepped outside anyway. Staying in bed would not make food appear. Life had taught her that much. The streets were already alive. Vendors shouted prices, engines roared, and music spilled from shops that sold more hope than goods. Beata walked past them all, holding her empty basket like a shield. At the intersection, she spread her cloth on the ground out of habit. There was no fruit to arrange today, no colors to attract customers. Just a pregnant girl, sitting beside an empty cloth, hoping someone might still notice her. Nalia arrived shortly after, her face creased with concern the moment she saw Beata's bare display. "You didn't buy anything?" she asked quietly. Beata shook her head. "I had nothing left." Nalia sighed and sat beside her. "You shouldn't have given that man everything." "I know. Knowing doesn't fill your stomach." "No," Beata agreed softly, but it filled his. They sat in silence, watching people rush by. Most avoided their eyes. Poverty made others uncomfortable. It reminded them how thin the line truly was. As the sun climbed higher, Beata's vision blurred slightly. She adjusted her sitting position, breathing slowly, willing her body to cooperate. Then, through the crowd, she saw a familiar figure. The old man. MC Samuel Cotto approached slowly, his steps unsteady but determined. He looked cleaner today, as if he had washed somewhere, but he was still painfully thin. For a moment, Beata wondered if hunger was making her imagine things. He stopped in front of her and lowered himself carefully to the ground. "I was looking for you," he said. Nalia stiffened. "Why?" Mzee Samuel turned to her politely. "To thank her again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of bread, barely more than a crust. "This is all I have," he said, offering it to Beata. "Please, eat." Beata stared at the bread. She shook her head immediately. "No, you need it more than I do. You are carrying life," he replied gently. I am only carrying my past. Nalia stood up sharply. We don't need this, she snapped. You already took what little she had. Mzee Samuel did not react with anger. He only nodded slowly. I understand, he said. I will not trouble you. He placed the bread on the ground between them and rose to his feet. God sees, he added quietly, even when people do not. Then he walked away. Beata felt a strange ache in her chest, not guilt, but something closer to sorrow mixed with respect. She watched him disappear into the crowd, unaware that this would be the last time she saw him standing. By midday, the heat became unbearable. Beata's head pounded and sweat soaked through her clothes. Nalia insisted she rest, but rest was impossible when fear sat heavy in her stomach. I think I should go home, Beata said finally, her voice weak. Nalia nodded. I'll walk you. They hadn't gone far when Beata's legs buckled. The world tilted violently, sounds stretching and bending. She felt Nalia's arms grab her just as the pavement rushed up to meet her. Beata Nalia shouted, Stay with me. People gathered curious but hesitant. No one wanted responsibility. I can't, see, Beata whispered, her belly tightened sharply, pain spreading low and deep. Fear flooded her. This is too early, she thought desperately. It's too soon. A motorbike rider nearby hesitated, then stepped forward. She needs a hospital, he said. Nalia looked up, panic in her eyes. Please, help us. They lifted Beata carefully onto the back of the motorbike, Nalia holding her from behind, whispering prayers into her ear as the city blurred past. At the hospital, chaos greeted them. The waiting area was packed. People sat on the floor on benches against walls. The air buzzed with coughs, cries, and exhausted hope. A security officer raised his hand. What is it? She's pregnant, Nalia said quickly. She collapsed. Beata barely registered being lifted onto a stretcher, barely felt the wheels roll beneath her. Pain and hunger tangled together until she couldn't tell them apart. In another wing of the same hospital, unseen by Beata, Mzee Samuel Kato lay on a bench outside the emergency ward. His breathing was shallow. His chest burned. Every breath felt like pulling air through water. He had tried to walk away from the pain as he always did, but this time his body refused. A nurse knelt beside him. Sir, can you hear me? He nodded faintly. Do you have family, Mzee? Samuel closed his eyes. Images flashed behind his lids, a younger version of himself, strong and hopeful. A small boy holding his hand. Promises whispered under a leaky roof. Yes, he whispered. A son. Do you have his number? His trembling hand reached into his pocket. Back in the maternity ward, Beata cried out as another wave of pain tore through her. Dr. Emmanuel Okello leaned over her, calm but focused. You're dehydrated and malnourished, he said gently. We need to stabilize you. Is my baby? Beata asked, her voice breaking. We're doing everything we can. Tears slid down her temples and into her hair. I didn't mean for this, she whispered. I just wanted to help someone. Dr. Okello paused, his eyes softening. Kindness does not come with guarantees, he said quietly, but it still matters. In the emergency ward, a phone rang. Mzee Samuel held it to his ear with effort. Robert, he said weakly. It's me. On the other end of the line, silence fell like a dropped glass. I'm at the hospital, Mzee, Samuel continued, if you still remember where I am. The call ended. 2 lives, one beginning, one fading, were now bound by the same walls, and neither Beata nor Robert Kato yet understood how close they were to each other. The afternoon light slanted through the high windows of the hospital, pale and unforgiving. It illuminated every crack in the paint, every tired face, every unspoken fear that lived inside the building. Beata Habimana lay on a narrow hospital bed, her body trembling as an IV drip slowly fed fluids into her weakened veins. The sharp pains had eased slightly, replaced by a dull, constant ache that made her afraid to move. Her lips were dry, her throat burned. But worse than the physical pain was the fear sitting heavy in her chest. She turned her head toward Dr. Emmanuel Okello as he adjusted the monitor beside her bed. Doctor, she whispered, please tell me the truth. He met her eyes, choosing his words carefully. Your body is exhausted, Beata. You've been surviving on too little for too long. And my baby? He hesitated for just a second too long. The baby is under stress, he admitted, but there is still hope. We are monitoring closely. Hope. The word sounded fragile, like glass. Beata closed her eyes, her hand resting protectively over her belly. I didn't mean to be careless, she murmured. I couldn't watch him starve. Dr. Okello nodded slowly. Sometimes the kindest hearts carry the heaviest burdens. Outside the ward, Nalia Uwimana paced back and forth, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. Guilt gnawed at her with every step. If I had just shared my food, she whispered to herself. If I'd stopped her. A nurse stepped out briefly. She's stable for now, the nurse said, but she needs rest and nutrition. Nalia swallowed hard. She has no family, she said quietly. It's just us. The nurse sighed, a sound heavy with familiarity. We see many like her. In another corridor, separated by walls but bound by fate, Mzi. Samuel Cato lay on a stretcher, oxygen mask pressed to his face. His breathing rattled faintly, each inhale a small victory, each exhale a surrender. A nurse checked his pulse. Blood pressure is low, she said. We need to move him to emergency. As they wheeled him forward, his eyes fluttered open. Through the haze of pain, he saw white coats, heard hurried footsteps, and felt the cold hand of fear wrap around his heart. I don't want to die alone, he whispered. The nurse leaned closer. We're here. But Mzi Samuel shook his head weakly. I called my son, he said. He's coming. She nodded, not knowing whether to believe him. Across the city, Robert Cato sat frozen behind the wheel of his car, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the call had ended. Father. The word echoed painfully in his mind. For years, Robert had buried that part of his life beneath meetings, contracts, and expansion plans. He had told himself that his father had chosen his own path, that distance was inevitable, that success required sacrifice. But now, images he had avoided surged forward, his father's rough hands guiding him as a boy, the quiet pride in his eyes, the way he had stood back so his son could step forward. Robert turned the key in the ignition, his hands shaking for the first time in years. Hold on, he muttered. Please, just hold on. Back in the maternity ward, evening crept in slowly. Beata's hunger had dulled into a hollow numbness. A nurse brought her a small bowl of porridge. Eat, the nurse urged gently. For the baby. Beata lifted the spoon with effort. Each bite felt heavy, but she forced herself to swallow, imagining strength flowing back into her body, into her child. As she ate, her thoughts drifted back to the old man, Mzi Samuel. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not with pity but with gratitude, the way his voice had trembled when he spoke of blessings. Where are you now? She whispered to the ceiling. Are you safe? She did not know that just a few corridors away he was fighting for every breath. In the emergency ward, alarms beeped softly as Mzi Samuel's condition worsened. His grip on consciousness weakened, memories slipping through his fingers like sand. He saw his wife Esther smiling softly in their old kitchen. You did your best, she seemed to say. I hope so, he whispered. A nurse rushed in. His son is here, she said urgently. Moments later, Robert Cato burst through the doors. The sight of his father on the stretcher shattered something inside him. The man who had once seemed unbreakable now looked impossibly small. Father Robert said, his voice breaking as he reached the bedside. Mzi Samuel's eyes opened slowly. Robert, he breathed. A faint smile touched his lips. You came. Robert grabbed his hand, gripping it tightly as if refusing to let go would change fate itself. I'm here, he said. I'm here now. Tears slid freely down his face, unchecked, unashamed. I should have come sooner, Robert whispered. I should have looked for you. Mzi Samuel squeezed his hand weakly. Life took us both. Different ways, he murmured. But you are here. That is enough. The machines hummed around them, indifferent witnesses to a reunion shaped by regret and love. In the maternity ward, Beata suddenly gasped as a sharp pain tore through her. The monitor spiked. Dr. Okello rushed to her side. Easy, he said firmly. Breathe with me. I'm scared, Beata cried. Please, I'm scared. I know, he replied. But you are not alone. She clutched his sleeve. If something happens to me, please take care of my baby. Dr. Okello held her gaze. We are doing everything possible. Night fell fully now, wrapping the hospital in shadows broken only by fluorescent lights. 2 rooms, 2 battles, 2 souls hanging between loss and hope. Robert sat beside his father, refusing to leave. He watched every rise and fall of Mzi Samuel's chest, counting breaths like prayers. Across the hall, Beata drifted in and out of sleep, whispering promises to the life inside her. Neither knew that their paths, already crossed by $7 and a simple act of kindness, were about to collide again in ways neither could imagine. And as the hospital clock ticked toward midnight, fate waited patiently, ready to reveal the true cost and the true reward of compassion. Morning came without mercy. The fluorescent lights of the hospital never dimmed, but Beata Habimana could tell it was morning by the change in noise, the shuffle of new patients, the tired voices of nurses starting another long shift, the distant sound of traffic growing louder outside. Her body felt heavy, as if gravity itself had increased overnight. She opened her eyes slowly and stared at the cracked ceiling above her bed. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the dull ache in her abdomen reminded her of everything at once: the hunger, the collapse, the fear. A nurse noticed her stirring and came closer. "You're awake," she said gently. "How are you feeling?" Beata tried to answer, but her throat felt tight. She swallowed. "Weak," she whispered. "That's expected," the nurse replied. "You've been malnourished for some time." Beata turned her head slightly. "My baby?" The nurse paused, checking the chart. "The baby is still holding on," she said carefully. "But you must eat. You must rest." Holding on. Beata closed her eyes again. She had spent her entire pregnancy holding on to hope, to faith, to the belief that doing good would somehow protect her. Now she wasn't so sure. Later that morning, Nalia Uwimana slipped quietly into the ward. Her eyes were red as if she hadn't slept. "You scared me," Nalia said, forcing a smile as she pulled a chair closer. "I thought I was going to lose you." Beata reached out weakly and squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize," Nalia said quickly. "I should have helped more. I should have shared what I had." Beata shook her head. "We're all just trying to survive." Nalia hesitated, then spoke softly. "Mama Chantal came looking for you last night." Beata's heart sank. "What did she say?" "She said your things are outside. She said you can't stay there anymore." The words hit harder than Beata expected. No room, no bed, no place to go after the hospital. She turned her face away, blinking back tears. "I understand." Nalia clenched her fists. "You're in the hospital. She has no heart." Beata managed a faint smile. "Maybe she's just afraid. People get afraid when they think they might lose what little they have." Nalia looked at her stunned. "How can you still think like that?" Beata didn't answer. She didn't know how to explain that anger took energy and she had none left to give. Across the hospital, in a quieter, more guarded room, Robert Cato sat beside his father's bed. Mz. Samuel Cato looked smaller than ever under the thin white sheets. His breathing was labored, each inhale a struggle that made Robert's chest tighten in response. A doctor spoke softly to Robert outside the room. "He's very weak. Years of exposure, poor nutrition. His body has been fighting for too long." Robert nodded, his jaw clenched. "What can I do?" "Be here," the doctor replied honestly. "That matters more than you think." Robert returned to the bedside and took his father's hand again. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have looked for you sooner." Mz. Samuel opened his eyes slightly. "You were busy building your world," he murmured. "I didn't want to be a burden." "You were never a burden," Robert said, his voice cracking. Mz. Samuel smiled faintly. Then, "Don't carry guilt now. Carry kindness instead." Those words echoed strangely in Robert's mind. Kindness. It was a word rarely spoken in boardrooms. In the maternity ward, Beata was discharged that afternoon with strict instructions: rest, eat regularly, return immediately if the pain worsened. The problem, of course, was that instructions did not come with solutions. Nalia helped her stand, wrapping an arm around her waist as they slowly made their way out of the hospital. Outside, the sun felt too bright. The world moved too fast. "Where will you go?" Nalia asked quietly. Beata didn't answer right away. They walked toward the area where her shack had been. But as they approached, Beata saw her few belongings piled on the ground. A thin mattress, a bucket, a small bag of clothes. Mama Chantal stood nearby, arms crossed. "I told you," she said flatly. "No money, no room." Beata nodded slowly. "I understand." Mama Chantal hesitated for just a second, then turned away. "I can't feed another mouth." Beata bent slowly, picking up her bag. Her body protested with every movement. Nalia's eyes burned with anger. "You can stay with me," she offered. "It's crowded," but Beata shook her head gently. "You barely have space for yourself." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by noise and indifference. Then Beata felt it, a sharp, unmistakable pain. She gasped and grabbed Nalia's arm. "Something's wrong." Panic flared instantly. "We need to go back," Nalia said. But Beata's legs gave out again. This time there was no crowd to gather, no motorbike nearby, Just fear. Back inside the hospital, Dr. Okello frowned as he examined her. Your body is under extreme stress, he said. You're pushing yourself too hard. I don't have a choice, Beata whispered. You do, he said firmly, but it will require help. She turned her face away. Help costs money. Dr. Okello sighed. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. In the emergency ward, Mzee Samuel stirred suddenly. Beata, he whispered. Robert leaned forward sharply. Who the girl, Mzee Samuel murmured. The pregnant girl? She fed me. Robert froze. What girl? Mzee Samuel's breathing grew shallow. She gave me everything she had. Robert's mind raced. A pregnant girl. $7. Kindness without conditions. Suddenly the word kindness felt heavier than guilt. Where is she? Robert asked urgently. Mzee Samuel's eyes fluttered. I don't know, but God knows. The monitor beeped faster. Robert stood abruptly. Find her, he said to a nurse nearby. A pregnant woman. She collapsed recently. The nurse hesitated. There are many pregnant women here. Please, Robert said, his voice raw. She saved my father's life for one more day. I owe her everything. As the nurse hurried off, Robert returned to his father's side. Rest, he said softly. I'll take care of it. Mzee Samuel smiled faintly. You already are. Back in the maternity ward, Beata lay curled on the bed, exhausted and frightened. She had given away her last $7. She had lost her home. She had nothing left to offer. And yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice still whispered that kindness was never truly wasted. She didn't know it yet, but the cost of her compassion was about to be repaid in ways far greater than she could imagine. The night wrapped itself around the hospital like a heavy blanket, pressing down on every room, every breath, every fear that refused to sleep. Beata Habimana lay awake, staring at the pale blue curtain that separated her bed from the rest of the ward. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. Each movement of the baby inside her brought both comfort and terror. She was still here. But for how long Dr. Emmanuel Okello had ordered her to stay overnight for observation? It was not a suggestion this time. Her blood pressure was unstable, her body weakened by weeks of hunger and stress. Yet Beata's mind refused to rest. Where would she go tomorrow? Her belongings were gone. Her room was gone. Her money was gone. Even Nalia, kind as she was, lived one breath away from desperation herself. Beata placed both hands on her belly. I'm sorry, she whispered. I wanted to give you a better beginning. The baby responded with a soft kick, gentle but firm, as if refusing to accept her apology. Across the hospital, Robert Cotto stood in the hallway, phone pressed tightly to his ear. Find her, he said again, his voice low but urgent. A pregnant woman who collapsed today. She helped my father. I'm checking the admission records. A staff member replied on the other end. There are several. Please, Robert interrupted, unable to hide the strain. Time matters. He ended the call and leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. For the first time in years, no amount of money, no signature, no influence felt powerful enough. All his success suddenly seemed small. Inside the emergency room, Mzee Samuel Cotto's condition worsened. The machines around his bed beeped with growing insistence, as if urging his body to fight harder. His breathing was shallow now, his skin pale beneath its dark tone. Robert returned to his side, taking his father's hand once more. I'm here, he whispered. You're not alone. Mzee Samuel's eyes fluttered open briefly. She was hungry too, he murmured. But she fed me. Robert swallowed hard. I know. Promise me, Mzee Samuel continued weakly. Promise you'll help her. Robert squeezed his hand tightly. I promise. It was not a promise he made lightly. Back in the maternity ward, Beata suddenly gasped as a sharp pain ripped through her abdomen. She cried out involuntarily, clutching the bed rails as her body tensed. A nurse rushed over. What's happening? I don't know, Beata said through clenched teeth. It hurts. It hurts more than before. The nurse checked the monitor, her expression tightening. Dr. Okello arrived within seconds, his calm demeanor hiding the urgency beneath. Beata, listen to me, he said firmly. You're having early contractions. Fear flooded her instantly. No, it's too soon. We're going to do everything we can, he replied. But your body is under severe stress. She shook her head frantically. Please, please save my baby. We're trying, he said gently, but you must stay calm. Calm. The word felt cruel. Pain surged again, stronger this time, stealing her breath. Tears streamed down her face as she fought not just the pain but the overwhelming sense of failure. She had tried to be strong, she had tried to be kind, and now it felt like everything was slipping away. At the same time, in the emergency ward, alarms suddenly blared. A nurse shouted, "He's crashing!" Robert jolted upright as doctors and nurses swarmed around his father's bed. He was pushed gently but firmly aside as hands worked quickly, voices sharp and focused. Clear. The room filled with controlled chaos. Robert stood frozen, watching his father's life teeter on the edge of silence. "Don't leave," he whispered. "Please, don't leave yet." Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, the monitor stabilized slightly. The room exhaled. Dr. Okello emerged from Beata's ward at that exact moment, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes met Robert's by chance as he hurried down the corridor. Robert hesitated, then stepped forward. "Doctor," he said, "are there any pregnant patients here who collapsed today?" Dr. Okello paused, studying him carefully. "There is," he said slowly. "Why, my father?" Robert replied, his voice raw. She helped him. She gave him food when he was starving. Understanding flickered across the doctor's face. "She's in danger," Dr. Okello said honestly. "Both of them are." Robert didn't hesitate. "Take me to her." Inside the maternity ward, Beata cried out again, her voice hoarse, her strength fading. "I'm scared," she sobbed. "I don't want to die." Dr. Okello leaned close. "You're not dying," he said firmly, though fear tugged at his own chest. "Stay with me." The curtain suddenly shifted. Beata turned her head weakly, expecting another nurse. Instead, she saw a tall man in an expensive suit standing just inside the ward, his face tight with emotion. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating. Robert stopped a few steps from her bed. This was the girl, the one his father had spoken of with gratitude and awe. She looked impossibly small against the white sheets, her face. Pale eyes rimmed with exhaustion and fear. "This is her," Dr. Okello said quietly. Robert's throat tightened. Beata struggled to sit up. "I'm sorry," she whispered reflexively, not even knowing why. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Robert shook his head, unable to speak for a moment. "You saved my father," he said finally, his voice breaking. "You saved him when no one else would." Beata frowned weakly. He was hungry. That $7, Robert continued, meant everything to him, and to me. She shook her head faintly. "It was nothing." Robert took a step closer. "It was everything." Another contraction tore through her, cutting off the moment. She screamed, clutching her belly as the monitor spiked wildly. Dr. Okello snapped into action. "We need to prepare," he said urgently. "Now!" Robert stepped back instinctively, fear gripping him anew. He watched as nurses surrounded Beata, guiding her breathing, adjusting machines, doing everything humanly possible. "Please," Robert whispered, his hands clenched. "Please let them live." He had never prayed like this before. Outside the ward, Nalia arrived, breathless, eyes wide with panic. Beata Robert turned to her. "She's inside," he said softly. "They're doing their best." Nalia looked at him suspiciously. "Who are you?" "A man who owes her more than he can ever repay," Robert replied. Hours passed. The night deepened. 2 lives balanced on a fragile line. Finally, just before dawn, a baby's cry pierced the air, weak but unmistakably alive. Tears spilled down Beata's cheeks as she heard it. "She's here," a nurse said gently. "Your baby is here." Exhaustion swallowed Beata whole, but relief wrapped around her heart. Robert stood frozen, tears streaming openly now. His father was still alive. The child was alive. All because a poor pregnant girl had chosen kindness over fear. And as the first light of morning crept through the windows, Robert Cato realized something that would change him forever. Wealth could buy many things, but it could never buy a heart like hers. Dawn arrived quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile miracle it found inside the hospital. The sky outside shifted from deep blue to pale gray, and thin lines of light crept through the high windows, touching the floor like hesitant fingers. In the maternity ward, the chaos of the night had softened into exhaustion and whispered relief. Beata Habimana lay still. Her body drained her mind, floating somewhere between pain and peace. Her arms felt empty, even as her heart felt unbearably full. A nurse placed the baby gently beside her. "She's small," the nurse said softly, "but she's breathing on her own. That's a good sign." Beata turned her head slowly, tears blurring her vision. Her daughter. The tiny chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, each breath a quiet victory. Beata reached out with trembling fingers, afraid that touching her might make her disappear. "Hello?" she whispered. "You're so strong." The baby responded with a faint sound, barely more than a breath, but it was enough to break Beata completely. She sobbed silently, tears soaking the pillow beneath her head. Across the ward, Dr. Emmanuel Okello watched with a mixture of relief and concern. "She needs rest," he told the nurse, "and nutrition, real nutrition." The nurse nodded. "We'll do what we can." Outside the ward, Robert Cotto stood with his back against the wall, hands pressed over his face. The baby's cry still echoed in his ears. Alive. The word felt unreal. Nalia Uemana stood a few steps away, hugging herself tightly. She had witnessed many births on the streets, many endings too, but never something that felt this close to grace. "Is she?" Nalia asked quietly. Robert lowered his hands and looked at her. His eyes were red, his voice rough. "They're both alive." Nalia let out a shaky breath and covered her mouth. Thank God. Silence settled between them, heavy with everything that had nearly been lost. In the emergency ward, however, time moved differently. Aziz Samuel Cotto lay unconscious, machines breathing for him, now his body finally surrendering the strength it no longer possessed. The night had taken everything from him. Robert returned to his father's bedside just as the doctor adjusted the monitor. "His condition is critical," the doctor said carefully. "He may not wake again." Robert nodded slowly, his chest aching. "Can I sit with him?" "Of course." Robert pulled a chair close and sat down, taking his father's hand. "I found her," he whispered. "The girl you told me about." He swallowed hard. She nearly lost everything too, but she didn't complain. She didn't ask for anything. Robert leaned closer. "You were right, Father. Kindness still exists." For a moment nothing happened. Then Aziz Samuel's fingers twitched faintly. Robert froze. "Father," he whispered urgently. "Aziz." Samuel's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly settling on his son's face. "You're still here," he murmured. "Yes," Robert said, his voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere." A faint smile curved Aziz Samuel's lips. "Good." Robert bent closer. "She survived," he said, "the girl and her baby." Relief passed over the old man's face like a final sunrise. Then, "My hunger meant something," he whispered. "You mattered," Robert replied fiercely. "You always did." Aziz Samuel's breathing slowed, growing shallow. "Listen to me," he said weakly. "Everything I lost doesn't matter. What matters is what we give when we have nothing." Robert nodded, tears falling freely now. "I understand." Aziz Samuel's gaze drifted toward the ceiling. "Take care of her," he whispered, "and the child. I promise." The monitor let out a long, steady tone. The doctor stepped forward quietly and placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. Robert did not move. He sat there, holding his father's hand as the truth settled into his bones. The man who had raised him with nothing but love had died with nothing but had left behind something far greater. Later that morning, Dr. Okello stood at Beata's bedside again. "You did well," he said gently. "Both of you." Beata smiled weakly. "She's alive. That's all that matters. There's something else," he added carefully. "A man wants to see you." Beata frowned slightly. "Who?" Before he could answer, the curtain shifted. Robert stepped inside. He no longer looked like a powerful businessman. He looked like a son who had just buried his father. Beata struggled to sit up. "Please, you don't have to stay." Robert said quickly, "Please." He took a few careful steps closer, stopping at the foot of her bed. "My father died this morning," he said quietly. Beata's eyes widened. I'm so sorry." Robert nodded. "He spoke about you until the very end." She shook her head faintly. "I didn't do anything special. You gave him your last $7, Robert replied. "You fed him when you had nothing." Beata looked away. He was hungry. "So were you," Robert said softly. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Robert continued, "I want to help you." Beata stiffened. "I don't want charity." "I know," Robert said. "This isn't charity." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "This is gratitude and responsibility." She studied his face, searching for pity and finding none. What kind of help, she asked cautiously. A place to stay, he said. Medical care, food, time to heal. Beata hesitated. Pride warred with exhaustion. My friend Nalia will be included, Robert said quickly, if she wishes. Nalia's eyes filled with tears. Beata looked down at her daughter, then back at Robert. Just until I can stand on my own, she said firmly. Robert nodded. As long as you need. Outside the room, nurses moved quietly, life continuing its relentless rhythm. Inside, something shifted. Beata had lost her home. She had lost her strength. She had nearly lost her child, but she had gained something she hadn't expected, proof that kindness, even when it cost everything, did not vanish into the void. As Robert turned to leave, Beata called out softly, "Sir." He looked back. "My name is Beata," she said, "and thank you for keeping your promise." Robert nodded, his voice barely steady. "Thank you for teaching me what one looks like." And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the hospital walls, two lives, once strangers, began a new chapter bound not by wealth or obligation, but by a simple, unbreakable truth. What we give in our darkest moments can light the way for someone else. The days that followed moved gently, as if the world itself had decided to slow down for Beata Habimana and her newborn daughter. Morning sunlight filtered through the hospital windows, warmer now, less harsh than before. Beata woke to the quiet hum of the ward and the soft, uneven breathing of the baby sleeping beside her. Every time she opened her eyes and saw that tiny chest rising and falling, a wave of gratitude washed over her. She named her daughter Asha. "Because you are hope," Beata whispered, tracing a finger along the baby's cheek. Asha's fingers curled instinctively around Beata's fingertip, a fragile grip that felt stronger than any promise. Nalia Uemana visited every morning, bringing what little food she could spare: soft bread, a banana, sometimes warm porridge if she managed to sell enough maize early. "You look different," Nalia said one morning, smiling gently as she watched Beata feed the baby. Beata nodded. "I feel different." The fear was still there, but it no longer ruled her completely. Something steadier had taken its place. Across the hospital, Robert Cato stood in a quiet office staring out the window as the city moved below him. Cars honked, people hurried, life went on indifferent to the loss he carried inside. His father's funeral arrangements had been made quietly, respectfully. No cameras, no press, just a simple service as Mzee Samuel would have wanted. Robert had insisted on it. He lived simply, Robert had told his assistants. He should be honored the same way. Yet even as he handled logistics and calls, his thoughts kept returning to the maternity ward, to Beata, to the way she had apologized for causing trouble while lying in pain, to the way she had refused charity but accepted responsibility. Robert returned to the hospital that afternoon carrying a small envelope. He stopped outside Beata's room, listening for a moment before knocking softly. "Come in," Beata called. He stepped inside, suddenly unsure of himself. Beata smiled politely. "Good afternoon. How are you feeling today?" Robert asked. "Better," she said honestly. "Still tired, but alive." He nodded. "May I sit?" She gestured to the chair. "Of course." For a moment neither spoke. Robert cleared his throat. "I've arranged a small apartment," he said finally. "Not far from here. Nothing fancy." Beata stiffened slightly. "I told you I remember," Robert said quickly. "Just until you're strong enough. No contracts, no conditions." She studied his face again, searching for control, for expectation. She found only quiet sincerity. "What about the hospital bill?" she asked softly. "It's paid," Robert replied, "and the baby's care will be covered until she's stable." Beata exhaled slowly. "Thank you." He hesitated, then placed the envelope on the table. "This is not money," he said. "It's documents. The apartment lease is in your name." Her eyes widened. "In my name?" "Yes." Silence filled the room. "You don't even know me," Beata said quietly. Robert looked at Asha, sleeping peacefully. "I know enough." That evening, Beata left the hospital for the first time as a mother. Nalia helped her gather their few belongings while a nurse wrapped Asha carefully and placed her in Beata's arms. Outside, a car waited. Beata hesitated before stepping in. "I've never ridden in a car like this," she admitted. Robert smiled faintly. "Neither had my father for many years." The drive was short, but felt unreal. Beata pressed her forehead lightly against the window, watching the city pass by. The streets looked the same, yet everything felt changed. The apartment was small but clean. Sunlight filled the single room. There was a bed, a table, and a kitchenette. Nothing luxurious, just enough. Beata stood in the doorway, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say nothing," Robert replied. "Just rest." As the door closed behind him, Beata sat on the bed and held Asha close. "We have a roof," she whispered. "Just for now, but it's enough." That night, as Beata slept, Robert returned to his own home, a large, silent house that suddenly felt emptier than ever. He sat alone in the living room, the weight of his father's final words pressing down on him. Carry kindness instead. The next morning, Robert attended a board meeting. The room was polished and cold, filled with familiar faces and sharper questions. "You've been distracted," one board member said pointedly. "The market is watching." Robert listened calmly. "My father died," he replied, "and I discovered something important." The room fell quiet. "We are expanding," another member pressed. "This is not the time for—" "It is exactly the time," Robert interrupted. His voice was steady but firm. He stood. "We will establish a foundation focused on maternal health, homelessness, and emergency care." Murmurs rippled across the table. "This is not charity work," Robert continued. "It's responsibility." Some looked skeptical, others uncomfortable. "I'm not asking for permission," he finished. "I'm informing you." Later that day, Robert visited Beata again. This time he brought groceries in a small bassinet. Beata laughed softly when she saw it. "You're doing too much." Robert shook his head. "I'm learning." Days passed. Beata regained strength slowly. She learned Asha's rhythms, her cries, her quiet moments. Nalia visited often, sometimes staying late into the evening, helping however she could. One afternoon, as Beata folded baby clothes, she asked softly, "Why are you really helping me?" Robert paused. "Because he said when my father had nothing, you treated him like he mattered." Beata nodded slowly. "He did matter." "Yes," Robert agreed. "And so do you." That night, alone in her apartment, Beata thought about the $7 she had given away. At the time, it had felt like everything. Now she understood something deeper. Kindness doesn't disappear. It moves. It waits. And when the time is right, it returns often in ways we never expect. And somewhere between exhaustion and hope, Beata Habimana finally slept without fear. Grief has a strange way of reshaping time. For Robert Cotto, the days after his father's passing felt both unbearably slow and frighteningly fast. Meetings blurred together, phone calls stacked up unanswered. Condolences came in polished sentences that sounded distant, almost rehearsed. But at night, when the city finally quieted, grief arrived without warning. He would sit alone in his study, lights dimmed, the echo of his father's last breath replaying in his mind. In those moments, success felt meaningless. The wealth he had built could not buy one more conversation, one more apology, one more shared meal. One evening, Robert stood in front of a small wooden box he had brought back from the hospital. Inside were his father's few belongings, a worn scarf, a cracked phone, and a folded piece of paper. Curious, Robert unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. "If you find this, my son, know that I was never angry with you. I was proud. I just hoped one day you would remember that success means nothing if it leaves kindness behind." Robert closed his eyes, pain tightening his chest. "I remember now," he whispered. The next morning, he drove to Beata's apartment without calling ahead. Beata Habimana was sitting by the window, rocking Asha gently in her arms when she heard the knock. She opened the door cautiously and smiled when she saw Robert. "You didn't have to come so early," she said. "I needed to," he replied. He stepped inside, glancing around the modest room. It was clean, quiet, filled with a calm that felt rare and precious. "How is she?" he asked, nodding toward the baby. Beata smiled down at her daughter. Strong, hungry, loud. Robert chuckled softly, the sound surprising even himself. They sat at the small table, speaking quietly so as not to wake Asha. "Would you tell me about the day you met my father?" Robert asked after a pause. Beata hesitated, then nodded. "He was standing near my fruit stall," she began. "He looked tired, hungry. People told him to leave." She paused, remembering the fear that had twisted in her stomach that day. "I only had $7, she continued. "That was all. I knew I shouldn't give it away, but I couldn't ignore him." Robert listened without interrupting. He didn't ask for much. Beata said softly, "Just food. Just a little kindness." Robert swallowed hard. He didn't talk much about his life. Beata shook her head. He didn't complain. He thanked me. He prayed for my child. Silence filled the room. That prayer saved me, Beata added quietly. Robert leaned back, staring at the ceiling. I spent years chasing growth, expansion, numbers. He looked at her, and in one moment you taught my father and me what matters. Later that day, Robert returned to his office and called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team. The room was filled with sharp suits and sharper eyes. We need to talk about direction, Robert began. One executive leaned forward. If this is about the foundation, it's about accountability, Robert cut in calmly. He projected a slide showing hospital overcrowding, maternal mortality rates, homelessness statistics across the region. These aren't abstract problems, he said. They are happening outside these walls. Another executive frowned. This isn't our sector. Robert met his gaze steadily. It's our responsibility. There was resistance. There always was when profit felt threatened. But Robert did not back down. My father died because the system forgot him, he said quietly. I won't forget others the same way. The meeting ended without full agreement, but it ended with understanding. That evening, Beata received an unexpected visitor. Mama Chantal Mukamana stood awkwardly in the doorway, her usual sharp expression replaced by discomfort. I heard you had the baby, Mama Chantal said stiffly. Beata nodded. Yes, I didn't know you were that sick. Mama Chantal continued. People talk. Beata remained silent. Mama Chantal cleared her throat. I came to apologize. The word seemed to surprise even her. I was afraid, Mama Chantal admitted. Afraid of not having enough. Beata's voice was calm. I understand. Mama Chantal glanced at the baby, softening slightly. She's beautiful. Thank you. After she left, Beata sat quietly reflecting. Forgiveness, she realized, was another form of kindness, one that also cost something. A few days later, Robert invited Beata and Nalia to a small memorial service. There were no cameras, no speeches, just a few chairs under a tree and a simple wooden marker with Mzee Samuel Cato's name. Beata stood silently, holding Asha close as Robert placed flowers on the ground. My father believed in quiet goodness, Robert said softly. He lived it, and in the end he was saved by it. Beata bowed her head. After the service, Robert turned to her. I want you to help me, he said. She looked up, surprised. Help you how? With the foundation, he replied. I need someone who understands the reality not from reports, but from life. Beata hesitated. I don't have education or experience. You have wisdom, Robert said, and honesty. Nalia's eyes widened. Beata looked down at Asha, then back at Robert. I don't want power, she said carefully. I want dignity, for people like us. Robert nodded. That's exactly why I'm asking. That night, Beata lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling once again. But this time not from fear. She thought about the path ahead, the responsibility, the possibility. She had given away $7 without expecting anything in return. Now life was asking her something else, not to give but to stand, to speak, to guide, to remember. As Asha stirred beside her, Beata smiled softly. Hope, she whispered again. And in the quiet of the night she understood something she had never known before. Sometimes the greatest return on kindness is not what we receive, but who we become. Beata Habimana did not sleep much that night. Asha lay beside her, breathing softly, her tiny fingers curled into loose fists. The room was quiet, but Beata's mind was loud. Robert's words echoed again and again in her thoughts. I want you to help me. She had spent her entire life surviving, finding food, finding shelter, finding the strength to stand one more day. No one had ever asked her to help shape anything larger than her own survival. Now, suddenly, she was being invited into something that felt far bigger than her fears. As the first light of morning crept through the curtains, Beata sat up slowly and looked at her daughter. What do you think? She whispered. Are we ready for this? Asha shifted, letting out a small sound that almost resembled a sigh. Beata smiled faintly. I'll take that as a yes. Later that morning, Robert Cato arrived with a driver not in a convoy, not with assistants trailing behind him, just himself. He knocked lightly. Beata opened the door, Asha wrapped securely against her chest. You came early, Beata said. Robert nodded. I didn't want to rush you, but I also didn't want you to feel alone with the decision. They sat at the small table again, sunlight filling the room. "I want to be clear," Beata began. "I won't be a symbol. I won't sit quietly while others make decisions." Robert smiled slightly. "I wouldn't respect you if you did." She took a deep breath. "I don't want people to be helped in a way that humiliates them." "I agree," Robert said immediately. "My father hated pity. He wanted dignity." Beata nodded. "Then I'll help, but only if we do this the right way." Robert extended his hand across the table, not as a businessman sealing a deal, but as a man asking for trust. Beata hesitated only a moment before taking it. That afternoon, Beata's world shifted again. Robert brought her to a modest office space, not in the towering headquarters of Cato Global, but in a small building near the hospital. "This will be the Foundation's first office," Robert explained. Accessible. Visible. Beata looked around. The walls were plain, the furniture simple. "It's perfect," she said. They met with a small team: social workers, a nurse, a legal advisor, people who spoke less and listened more. Beata sat quietly at first, absorbing the conversation. "We can focus on maternal care," one woman suggested. "Emergency housing and food programs," another added. Beata cleared her throat softly. Everyone turned toward her. "We need to ask people what they need," she said, "not tell them." The room fell silent. "They already know their problems." Beata continued. "They don't need us to explain poverty to them. They need support that doesn't shame them." Robert watched her closely, pride flickering in his eyes. That evening, as Beata returned home, she found Nalia waiting for her outside the apartment, arms crossed nervously. "You went somewhere fancy today," Nalia said, half joking. Beata laughed softly. "Not fancy, just different." They sat together on the steps as Beata explained everything. "You," Nalia said in disbelief. "Working with a billionaire, I don't work for him," Beata corrected gently. "I work with him." Nalia studied her for a long moment. "You've changed." Beata shook her head. "No, I'm just standing where I used to sit." The following days were filled with learning. Beata visited shelters. She listened to mothers who slept in shifts so their children could rest. She met men who once had jobs, families' homes now reduced to waiting. She did not promise miracles. She promised presence. At one shelter, a woman recognized her. "You're the one," the woman said, "the pregnant girl." Beata nodded, embarrassed. "You gave food to that old man," the woman continued. "People talk about that." Beata looked down. "I didn't think anyone noticed." The woman smiled sadly. "We notice kindness, even when the world doesn't." Back at the hospital, Beata visited the maternity ward where she had nearly lost everything. She stood quietly at the doorway, memories flooding back. Dr. Emmanuel Okello spotted her and smiled. "You look stronger," he said. "I feel stronger," Beata replied. He glanced at Asha and her hope. Beata said simply. Dr. Okello nodded, understanding. One afternoon, Beata attended her first board discussion with Robert and the Foundation's advisors. The conversation turned tense when funding priorities came up. "We need visibility," one advisor argued, "public campaigns." Beata raised her hand slightly. "Visibility can wait," she said calmly. "People can't." The room quieted. "If someone is sleeping on the street tonight," she continued, "they don't need our logo. They need a blanket." Robert leaned forward. "She's right. Not everyone agreed." Later, alone with Robert, Beata voiced her concern. "They don't trust me," she said. "They don't know you yet," Robert replied. "Give them time." Beata sighed. "I don't want to become someone who forgets where she came from." Robert met her gaze. "That's exactly why you won't." That night, Beata held Asha close and thought about the old version of herself sitting by an empty fruit cloth, $7 gone, fear pressing in from every direction. She had believed kindness might destroy her. Instead, it had rebuilt her piece by piece. Across the city, Robert stood in his office late reviewing proposals he once would have dismissed without thought. He paused at one document and smiled faintly. For the first time, his work felt aligned with something deeper than ambition. In the quiet hours before dawn, two lives once separated by class, comfort, and circumstance were now moving forward together, guided by a shared truth neither had learned in business school or survival manuals. Real change does not begin with power. It begins with listening. And as Beata Habimana closed her eyes, exhaustion finally pulling her into sleep, she knew the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in her life, she was not walking it alone. Success did not arrive gently. For Beata Habimana, it came with resistant suspicion and a weight she had never carried before. The foundation's work began quietly: emergency housing vouchers, hospital support for pregnant women, food distribution through local vendors rather than handouts. Beata insisted on using the same markets she once sold fruit and paying vendors fairly, so dignity flowed both ways. At first it worked, then people started to talk. She's being used, some whispered. She's the Billionaire's project, others said. Soon she'll forget where she came from. Beata heard every word. One afternoon, after a long day visiting shelters, she returned to the office to find raised voices in the meeting room. "This is not sustainable," one advisor snapped. "We need numbers, reports, proof." Robert Cato stood at the head of the table, jaw tight. "We're not running a factory. You're running a foundation," the advisor shot back. "And donors want structure." Beata paused outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. She took a breath and stepped in. "May I speak?" she asked calmly. The room fell silent. "You want proof?" Beata continued, her voice steady. "Come with me. Walk the streets at night. Sit with the women who sleep in shifts so their babies can breathe. That's your proof." Some avoided her eyes. "We can give reports," she said, "but we cannot lose the people inside them." The meeting ended without resolution. Later, Robert found Beata sitting alone in the office, staring at nothing. "They don't listen," she said quietly. "They will," Robert replied. "You're changing how they see things." Beata shook her head. "Change scares people." "Yes," Robert agreed, "but so does stagnation." That evening, Nalia visited, bringing cooked beans wrapped carefully in cloth. "You look tired," Nalia said. "I am," Beata admitted. Nalia hesitated. "People are saying things." Beata smiled sadly. "They always do." Nalia studied her. "Do you regret it?" Beata looked at Asha, asleep against her chest. "No, but sometimes I miss the simplicity of worrying only about tomorrow." That night, the phone rang just after midnight. Robert answered immediately. "There's been an incident," a staff member said urgently. "One of the shelters we partner with, there's a woman in labor. Complications." Beata was awake before Robert reached her apartment. "I'm coming," she said, already reaching for her scarf. At the hospital, chaos greeted them. A young woman lay on a gurney, screaming in pain. Her clothes were soaked with sweat and fear. "I don't have money," the woman cried. "Please, please don't send me away." Beata moved instinctively to her side. "You're safe," Beata said firmly, gripping her hand. "You're not alone." Dr. Emmanuel Okello appeared moments later, recognition flickering across his face. "She needs surgery," he said quickly. "Now." A nurse hesitated. "There's paperwork." "Do it," Robert said sharply. "I'll handle it." Hours passed. Beata sat in the corridor, Asha with Nalia, her own heart racing as memories surged back: pain, fear, helplessness. Finally, Dr. Okello emerged. "The mother survived," he said. "The baby, too." Beata sagged with relief, tears streaming down her face. As dawn broke, Robert stood beside her. "This is why we're doing this," he said quietly. Beata nodded. "This is why." But news of the incident traveled fast. By afternoon, reporters were calling. Social media buzzed. Headlines twisted facts into spectacle. Billionaire Foundation saves poor woman. Charity or control? Beata read the comments with growing unease. She's just a face. She's being paraded. This is publicity. That night, Beata confronted Robert. "I don't want cameras," she said firmly. "I don't want stories that turn people into objects." Robert listened carefully. "We can limit exposure." "Not enough," Beata replied. "If this becomes about image, I'm done." Robert met her gaze. "Then we walk away from image." The next day, Robert made an announcement. The foundation would operate without press coverage. No photos of beneficiaries, no names released. Donors protested. Advisors warned him. Robert stood his ground. "My father died invisible," he said simply. "I won't make others visible, only when it benefits us." The backlash was immediate. Funding slowed. Partnerships hesitated. Beata felt the pressure keenly. One evening she sat alone in the apartment, doubts pressing in. "What if this fails?" she whispered to Asha. "What if I led them into nothing?" Asha stirred, letting out a soft cry. Beata held her close. "I'm afraid," she admitted. The next morning, Beata visited the old intersection where she used to sell fruit. The pavement was the same. The noise unchanged. She stood there quietly, remembering the girl she once was. A vendor recognized her. "You helped my sister," the woman said softly. "Thank you." Another voice called out, "Because of you, my wife got care." Beata's chest tightened. Maybe change didn't need applause. Maybe it needed consistency. That afternoon, a call came in. A small community group wanted to partner with no money, only volunteers. Then another, and another. The work continued, not loudly, not perfectly, but steadily. Late one night, Robert and Beata sat on the apartment floor, paperwork spread around them. "We might have to scale back," Robert said honestly. Beata nodded. "As long as we don't lose our core." Robert smiled faintly. "You're stronger than most people I've met." Beata looked at him. "Strength isn't loud, it just shows up every day." Outside, the city breathed. Inside, hope held on. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, Beata understood something clearly now. Kindness does not guarantee comfort, but it gives meaning to struggle. And meaning once found can carry a person farther than certainty ever could. The setback came quietly disguised as routine. Beata Habimana was reviewing case notes at the foundation office when the email arrived. It was short, formal, and devastating. Funding review, immediate suspension, pending audit. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she reread the message, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less final. They didn't. Robert Cotto read the email moments later, his expression tightening. "They're questioning our transparency," he said calmly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "They want documentation we don't have yet." Beata closed her eyes. "We've been too busy helping." "Yes," Robert said. "And not busy enough proving we're helping." The irony stung. By noon, calls poured in. A partner clinic paused services. A shelter asked if food deliveries would continue. A social worker pleaded for clarity. Beata felt the weight of each voice settle on her shoulders. "Give us time," she said gently, again and again. "Please." That afternoon, she visited the clinic where the young mother from the night before now rested with her newborn. The woman smiled weakly when she saw Beata. "They said you came back for me," she whispered. Beata squeezed her hand. "Always." As she stepped back into the heat, Beata's phone buzzed. It was Nalia. "They're talking," Nalia said quietly. "People think the foundation is closing." Beata leaned against the wall, steadying herself. "We're not closing. But what if we're not?" Beata repeated, though. Doubt crept in. That night, Beata sat at her small kitchen table, Asha asleep in a sling against her chest. Papers lay scattered, lists of families' helped receipts scribbled by hand, notes taken in haste. "This isn't enough," Beata whispered. "It never feels like enough." Robert arrived later, his suit loosened, his eyes tired. "We can appeal," he said, "but it will take time." "And people don't have time," Beata replied softly. They sat in silence, listening to the city outside. "I've been thinking," Beata said finally, "about scaling back but not retreating." Robert looked at her. "What do you mean?" "We focus on one thing," she said. "Maternal care, emergency response, the place where my life almost ended." Robert nodded slowly. "Depth instead of breadth." "Yes," Beata said. "If we save fewer people but save them well, it's still saving." The next morning, Beata called a meeting with the small team that remained. "We're simplifying," she told them. "No more promises we can't keep. We do what we can honestly." Some nodded with relief, others with fear. By afternoon, they had made hard decisions. Programs paused, partnerships ended gently. The office grew quieter. That evening, Beata returned home exhausted. She found Mama Chantal Mukamana waiting outside the apartment building. For a moment, Beata braced herself. "I heard things are difficult," Mama Chantal said stiffly. Beata nodded. "They are." Mama Chantal hesitated, then held out a small bag. "It's not much," she said. "Rice? Oil?" Beata stared surprised. "You don't have to?" "I know," Mama Chantal interrupted, "but you helped others. I can help you." Beata accepted the bag, emotion tightening her throat. "Thank you." Mama Chantal shifted uncomfortably. "People change," she said. "Sometimes they soften." That night, Beata cooked for the first time in weeks. The simple smell of rice filled the room, grounding her. She fed Asha, then sat on the floor, eating slowly, thinking. In another part of the city, Robert faced his own reckoning. The board was divided. "This is unsustainable," one member argued. "You're bleeding goodwill." Robert listened, then spoke evenly. "I'm willing to lose goodwill if it means keeping integrity." Integrity doesn't pay salaries, another snapped. Robert stood. Then maybe the system needs to change. He walked out before the argument could escalate. Late that night, Robert visited Beata again. I'm proud of you, he said quietly. Beata looked up surprised. For what? For choosing people over perception, he replied. She smiled faintly. It's the only choice I know. The next morning, a woman arrived at the foundation office with a baby wrapped in cloth. I was told you could help, she said hesitantly. Beata swallowed. We can try. They found space. They found supplies. They found time. Word spread not through headlines but through whispers. She listens. She stays. She doesn't disappear. One evening, Beata received a call from Dr. Okello. There's an opportunity, he said. A government grant small but steady. They need someone credible to lead it. Beata hesitated. Credible you, he said simply. The application process was slow and exhausting. Interviews, reviews, doubts. Weeks passed. Then, one quiet afternoon, the call came. You've been approved. Beata sank into her chair, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That night, Beata and Robert sat together, paperwork spread out once more, this time with cautious hope. We're not winning, Beata said softly, but we're not losing either. Robert smiled. Sometimes survival is the victory. As Asha slept between them, Beata reflected on the journey. Kindness had cost her $7, then her home, then her certainty. But it had also given her community, purpose, and a strength she never knew she possessed. Outside, the city hummed indifferent, relentless, alive. Inside, Beata Habimana held onto a truth that had carried her this far. When the world pushes back, you don't need to push harder. You need to stand firmer. Stability, when it finally arrived, felt unfamiliar. Beata Habimana woke each morning expecting another crisis, another phone call, another shortage, another problem that would undo everything they had built. For so long, uncertainty had been her companion that calm felt almost suspicious. The government grant allowed the foundation to reopen a small but consistent maternal care program at the hospital. It wasn't grand. It didn't attract attention, but it saved lives. Beata spent her days moving between the clinic and the office, listening more than speaking, absorbing the quiet rhythm of purposeful work. Then the past came knocking. One afternoon, as Beata was leaving the hospital, a voice stopped her mid-step. Beata. She turned slowly. The man standing a few feet away looked older than she remembered, thinner around the face, but she recognized him instantly. The father of her child. Her heart dropped. I heard about you, he continued awkwardly. People talk. Beata's grip tightened around Asha's blanket. What do you want? He shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know you almost died. I didn't know about the baby. Beata met his eyes steadily. You knew I was pregnant. That was enough. Silence hung between them. I made a mistake, he said quietly. I wasn't ready. Beata nodded. Neither was I, but I stayed. He glanced at the baby. She looks healthy. Because people showed up, Beata replied. Not because of you, he flinched. I thought maybe, he began. No, Beata interrupted firmly. This isn't a reunion. It's a boundary. He swallowed. I don't have much, but I can help now. Beata studied him for a long moment. Help yourself first, she said gently. Then we'll talk. She turned and walked away, her steps steady. That evening, Beata told Robert what had happened. You handled it with strength, Robert said. It didn't feel strong, Beata replied. It felt necessary. A few days later, tensions surfaced again, this time from within the foundation. Some staff members felt overwhelmed, others worried about burnout. We can't keep stretching like this, one nurse admitted. Even with funding, Beata listened carefully. We'll rotate shifts, she said, and we'll say no more often, but people will suffer, someone argued. Yes, Beata replied softly, but if we collapse, more will suffer. That night, Beata dreamed of the old intersection of fruit laid out on cloth, of $7 clutched in her hand. She woke with tears on her cheeks. The next morning, Robert called her into a meeting. There's pressure, he said honestly. Some board members want more visibility again, Beata sighed. They don't understand. They want sustainability, Robert said. But they define it differently. Beata leaned forward. Then we show them another way. Together they prepared a report not of numbers, but of stories. Anonymous, simple, human. A mother who survived childbirth, a baby who lived, a night when help arrived on time. The board meeting was tense. "This isn't measurable," one member complained. "It's undeniable," Robert replied. Beata spoke last. "We can't save everyone," she said, "but we can save someone today. That's enough for me." Silence followed. Then one member nodded slowly. "I used to think success was expansion," he admitted. "Now I think it's endurance." The vote passed narrowly. That evening, Beata returned home exhausted but lighter. Nalia was waiting, rocking Asha gently. "You've changed," Nalia said again. Beata smiled faintly. "I hope so." Nalia hesitated. "Do you ever wish you'd kept the $7? Beata laughed softly, surprised. "Sometimes, when I'm tired. Do you regret it?" Beata shook her head. "Never." Weeks passed. The foundation settled into a rhythm, not perfect, not easy, but real. Beata began training other women, listening, documenting, advocating. One afternoon, Mama Chantal stopped by again. "I wanted to see the baby," she said quietly. Beata invited her in. As Mama Chantal held Asha, her expression softened. "You changed more than your life," she admitted. "You changed how people see each other." Beata smiled. "We all change each other." Late one night, Beata sat alone reviewing files. The office was quiet, the city hushed. She paused at one name, Mzee Samuel Kato. The foundation's documents carried his legacy quietly, without ceremony. She whispered a thank you into the empty room. Across the city, Robert sat in his study reading a letter he had written but never sent to his father. "You were right," it read. "Kindness matters." The next morning, Beata received a message. A small rural clinic wanted to replicate their model. No funding, just guidance. Beata smiled. "Let's start," she said. As she packed up for the day, Beata looked at Asha sleeping peacefully. "You were born into chaos," she whispered, "but you will grow in purpose." Outside, the city continued busy, indifferent, alive. Inside Beata Habimana, something steady had taken root. She had faced hunger, fear, loss, and doubt. And still she had chosen to stand, not as a symbol, not as a savior, but as proof that one small act given freely could echo farther than anyone ever imagined. The invitation arrived without ceremony. It was a simple envelope left on Beata Habimana's desk. The paper slightly creased, the handwriting careful and restrained. Inside was a note requesting her presence at a closed meeting. No press, no donors, no speeches, just conversation. Beata read it twice, then folded it neatly and slipped it into her bag. Change, she had learned, rarely announced itself loudly. That afternoon, she sat across from a small group of decision-makers in a quiet conference room. The windows were open, letting in the sound of the city traffic voices' life. The air felt honest that way. They asked questions, not the sharp, skeptical ones she had grown used to, but softer ones. What keeps your program working? What would you do differently? What happens when the money runs out? Beata answered slowly, thoughtfully. "We listen," she said. "We adjust, and when resources shrink, we don't disappear, we shrink with them." One man leaned forward. "That sounds fragile." Beata met his gaze. "It is. But fragile things survive by bending." Silence followed. Not resistance, consideration. When the meeting ended, Beata stepped back into the sun, feeling neither triumphant nor defeated, just steady. That evening, she walked home instead of taking the car Robert had offered. She needed the ground under her feet, the familiar rhythm of movement, the reminder of where she came from. At a small corner, she stopped. The intersection. The place where she had once laid out fruit on a cloth. Where $7 had felt like a mountain. Where hunger had pressed so hard it blurred the edges of the world. She stood there for a long moment, watching vendors call out prices, watching people hurry past. A young woman approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Beata?" Beata nodded. "My sister told me about you," the woman continued. "She said you listen." Beata smiled gently. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the curb. "Tell me." They talked until the light softened and the air cooled. Beata gave no promises, only directions, contacts, encouragement. When the woman left, her shoulders looked lighter. At home, Nalia was waiting, rocking Asha as she hummed softly. "You missed bedtime," Nalia teased. "I know," Beata said, kissing Asha's forehead. "She forgives me." Nalia studied Beata's face. "Something changed today." Beata shrugged. "Maybe people are ready to listen." Nalia smiled. "Or maybe you're ready to be heard." Later that night, Robert visited. He looked tired, but relieved. "The meeting went well," he said. "They want to support replication, slowly, carefully. Beata nodded. That's how it should be. Robert hesitated, then spoke. There's something else. She waited. I've been thinking about leadership, he said. About visibility, about stepping back. Beata tilted her head. From what? From the front, Robert replied. This work doesn't need my face. It needs your voice and others like yours. Beata felt a flicker of fear. I never asked to lead, I know, Robert said softly. That's why you should. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to Asha's steady breathing. I'll stay, Robert added. I'll protect the work, but I don't want to shape it anymore. Beata considered this. Then we do it together, she said. But the decisions come from the ground. Robert smiled. Agreed. The weeks that followed were demanding in a different way. Beata trained coordinators, women who knew the weight of hunger, men who had slept on concrete, nurses who understood urgency. She taught them not procedures but posture, how to stand with people without standing over them. There were mistakes. A delivery arrived late, a referral failed. A night when beds ran out and tears came anyway. Beata faced each moment without flinching. We fix what we can, she would say, and we learn from the rest. One afternoon, she received a message from the rural clinic asking for guidance. Beata packed a small bag and traveled by bus, Asha secured against her chest. The clinic was modest, the staff exhausted, the need overwhelming. Beata didn't lecture. She listened. She shared what had worked and what had failed. Start small, she advised. Protect the people doing the work. Don't chase numbers. A nurse raised her hand. What if we disappoint people? Beata smiled gently. Then we tell the truth. Disappointment hurts less than abandonment. On the way back, the bus rattled over uneven roads. Beata held Asha close, humming softly. She thought of Missy Samuel, of his quiet dignity, of the way his gratitude had lingered in the air. She thought of the father of her child and the boundaries she had set without anger. She thought of $7 and how giving them had not erased her, but revealed her. That night, Beata wrote in a small notebook she kept tucked in her bag. Measure success by who remains when attention fades. The next morning brought rain. Beata watched it fall from the window, streaking the glass, washing the city clean in places and muddying it in others. Rain, like kindness, did not choose where it landed. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mama Chantal stood there holding a small plant in a clay pot. For the window, she said gruffly, "It needs light." Beata accepted it with a smile. "Thank you." As Mama Chantal left, Beata placed the plant near the sill. It leaned toward the brightness, leaves trembling slightly. Living things Beata thought knew how to reach. Later that day, Robert sent a brief message. They approved the next phase. No press, your terms. Beata closed her eyes and breathed out slowly. Not victory. Continuity. As evening fell, she rocked Asha gently and whispered, "You were born into a story that began before you. One day you'll add your own chapter." Asha stirred, then settled. Outside, the city lights flickered on. Inside, Beata Habimana felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Peace, not as an ending, but as a rhythm. The work would continue, the needs would persist, doubt would return. But she had learned how to stand, and she would keep standing. The first anniversary passed without ceremony. There were no banners, no speeches, no photographs arranged for approval. The foundation did not mark time the way corporations did. It measured it in quieter ways, through nights that ended with 2 heartbeats instead of 1, through mornings that began with pain but did not end in loss. Beata Habimana stood at the doorway of the clinic just before sunrise, watching the sky soften from gray to gold. She liked arriving early when the corridors were still calm and the air carried possibility instead of panic. Inside, a young nurse approached her. "The mother from room 3 is asking for you," she said. Beata nodded and stepped inside the small ward. The woman lay propped against pillows, a newborn sleeping on her chest. Her eyes filled when she saw Beata. "They told me you would come," the woman whispered. "I always do," Beata replied, gently pulling a chair closer. The woman hesitated, then said, "I was afraid to ask for help. I thought I would be judged." Beata shook her head. "Fear keeps people silent. We're here to listen." The woman nodded slowly, relief washing over her face. As Beata left the room, she paused, her hand resting briefly on the doorframe. Moments like this still humbled her. They reminded her why she had chosen depth over applause, truth over speed. Later that morning, Beata met Robert Cato outside the clinic. He looked different these days, less guarded, less hurried. "They're expanding the grant," he said quietly. "Slowly. On your model." Beata smiled faintly. "Good." Robert studied her. "You've built something that stands even when I step away." Beata looked at him steadily. That was always the point. They walked together for a while, not speaking. When they reached the corner, Robert stopped. "I'm going to take a longer leave," he said. "The board understands." Beata nodded. "You've earned rest," he smiled. "You taught me that rest is part of responsibility." Across the city, life moved on, vendors shouting prices, buses weaving through traffic, children laughing somewhere unseen. Change did not erase struggle. It lived beside it. That afternoon, Beata returned home earlier than usual. Asha was sitting upright now, supported by pillows, her eyes alert and curious. Nalia knelt beside her, making exaggerated faces until Asha burst into a delighted laugh. Beata laughed too, the sound light and unburdened. "She's fearless," Nalia said proudly. "She's curious." Beata replied, "That's even better." They sat together on the floor, sharing a simple meal. The apartment felt fuller these days, not with possessions, but with presence. As evening approached, Beata opened her notebook, the one that had followed her from clinics to buses to meetings. She turned to a fresh page and began to write. "Today, a woman trusted us with her fear. We did not solve everything, but we stayed." She closed the notebook and looked out the window at the plant Mama Chantal had given her. It had grown taller, its leaves wider, reaching steadily toward the light. There was a knock at the door. Mama Chantal stood there again, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "I heard you needed blankets," she said gruffly, "for the clinic." Beata accepted them with a smile. "We do. Thank you." Mama Chantal hesitated, then added, "You know, people talk less now. They watch more." Beata nodded. Watching is how learning starts. As Mama Chantal left, Beata felt a familiar warmth settle in her chest, the quiet confirmation that change, when rooted, spread in ways no campaign could engineer. That night, Beata carried Asha to bed and lay beside her, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. She thought of Imzi Samuel Cato, of his tired eyes, his careful gratitude, the way his final wish had been, not for comfort, but for continuity. She thought of $7, how small it had been and how vast it had become. She thought of the girl she once was, hungry, afraid, determined to survive one more day. And she understood fully now what had changed. She had not been saved by kindness. She had been shaped by it. In the weeks that followed, the Foundation's work continued, steady, grounded, unremarkable in the best way. New coordinators stepped forward. Old partners returned quietly. The clinic expanded, one room at a time. Beata traveled occasionally, always returning home before nightfall. She never stopped listening. She never stopped asking questions. One afternoon at the old intersection, Beata sat on the curb again, this time not to sell fruit but to wait. A young man approached hesitantly. "They said you would be here," he said. "They said you understand." Beata gestured for him to sit. "Tell me." He did, and she listened. As dusk settled, Beata rose and brushed dust from her hands. The city lights flickered on one by one. She walked home with Asha secured against her chest, the weight familiar and grounding. At the door, Beata paused and looked up at the sky. "Thank you," she whispered, not to fortune or fate, but to the simple truth that had guided her from the beginning. Kindness did not erase hardship. It did not guarantee safety. It did not come with applause. But it created paths where walls once stood. Inside, Beata placed Asha in her crib and sat beside her, watching her sleep. One day she whispered, "You'll hear this story. And when you do, I hope you remember this part." Asha stirred slightly, then settled again. Beata smiled. The story was not about a billionaire. It was not about rescue. It was not about miracles. It was about a choice made with $7 and an open heart. And as the city breathed around them, Beata Habimana knew without doubt that the truest wealth she would ever know was not what returned to her hands, but what had grown within her because she chose to give. Beata Habimana's story reminds us of a truth the world often forgets. Kindness is not measured by how much we have, but by how much we are willing to give when it costs us something real. She didn't help because she was strong, rich, or safe. She helped because she saw another human being in pain and chose compassion over fear. Her $7 did not change the world overnight. It did not protect her from hardship or struggle. In fact, it seemed to take everything from her at first. But kindness has a strange power. It moves quietly. It waits. And when the time is right, it returns not always as money, not always as comfort, but as purpose, dignity, and meaning. This story teaches us that doing good does not guarantee an easy life, but it gives our suffering direction. It turns pain into testimony. It turns survival into service. Beata didn't become extraordinary because someone saved her. She became extraordinary because she refused to harden her heart when life was hardest. In a world that tells us to protect ourselves first, her life asks a different question. Who might be saved if we choose to care anyway? And perhaps even more important, who might we become if this story touched your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever helped someone when it cost you something? Or has someone's kindness changed your life when you least expected it? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful emotional stories about humanity, hope, and the quiet strength of kindness. Your support helps these stories reach more hearts just like Beata's kindness did.